Hi history lovers, and welcome back to the channel where I bring you new videos every Friday looking at history from any time, anywhere. Today on History Calling, we're looking at Henry VIII's sixth wife, Catherine Parr, before she was queen. Best remembered as the woman who outlived Henry, her life before the throne is often overlooked despite the fact that it accounted for 31 out of her 36 years on earth, and was packed full of interesting events, including 2 marriages, imprisonment by rebels during the Pilgrimage of Grace, and the tale of how Catherine fell in love with another man, not Henry, while still married to her second husband. This video functions as a great prequel to a video I already have on Catherine's life as queen and after Henry's death, so why not watch this one first, followed by the other, which I'll leave linked in the description box. You'll also find links there to books and screen adaptations of Catherine's life which you may find interesting, as well as to my Instagram account. Please also remember to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel with notifications switched on so you never miss an upload. And now let's get back to the beginning of the life of Catherine Parr. Based on a letter from her mother in which she said that Catherine was less than 12 years old in July 1523, and the fact that her brother William was born on the 14th of August 1513, we know that this future queen entered the world sometime between July 1511 and October 1512, though the scholarship I've read all favours the year 1512. She was her parents' eldest surviving child, an older brother had already been lost, and after William would follow a sister named Anne in 1514. Their father was Sir Thomas Parr of Kendal, a courtier of Catherine's future husband Henry VIII. Their mother was the former Maud Green, a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon, after whom little Catherine was likely named and who was possibly the baby's godmother. The place of her birth has been debated, but was likely the family home in Blackfriars, London, rather than their increasingly ramshackle house, Kendal Castle in Westmoreland. Catherine's father died of plague in November 1517, leaving his daughters £800 between them for marriage portions. Biographer Antonia Fraser argues that Catherine was thereafter likely brought up in Northamptonshire, where her mother's family were from, though Susan James prefers Rye House in Hertfordshire. Catherine was well educated for a woman of her rank and era and spoke French among her other accomplishments, though she apparently learnt relatively little, if any, Latin, as we know she was studying it much later in life whilst queen. The story that she was educated with Princess Mary is almost certainly untrue, both because of the difference in their ages, Catherine was 4 years older, and because there's no mention of her as a childhood study buddy of Mary's in the accounts of the princess's youth. There is also another great story, which may be apocryphal as well, that Catherine was told by a fortune teller as a child that her hands were ordained for sceptres rather than needles, leading her to resist doing her sewing. Maud Parr began marriage negotiations for her eldest daughter's hand in 1523, and had initially hoped that Catherine would wed Henry Scrope, the son of Lord Scrope of Bolton and grandson of Lord Dacre. These negotiations ultimately failed in March 1524, however, as Catherine did not have a sufficiently impressive dowry to secure such a match. Instead, 5 years later, in 1529, at the age of about 17, she married Sir Edward Burgh, son of Thomas Lord Burgh of Gainsborough in Lincolnshire. Some older biographies of the Queen have confused Edward with his grandfather of the same name, who went insane, but it was the younger man whom Catherine married. Her father-in-law was, by all accounts, a deeply unpleasant individual, but after a spell living with him, in October 1530, he allowed the couple to take up residence in the manor of Kirton-in Lindsey in Lincolnshire. As for her religion, Catherine was born before the English Reformation and as such was raised a Catholic, and continued to be so into her adult life. Indeed, when her mother died in December 1531, she left her daughter an array of luxury items, including rosary beads given to her by Catherine of Aragon, alongside a jewelled portrait of Henry VIII. The young Catherine Parr's beliefs would change with time, however, as we'll see shortly. Though Edward was only a few years older than his wife, he was in poor health, and though records show that he was still alive in 1532, by April 1533 he was dead as well, leaving Catherine a childless, parentless widow barely out of her teens and with a modest jointure, which is the money a widow was granted from her husband's estate to live off. She didn't stay that way for long. Either that year or the next, different sources give different dates, she married again, this time to a much older man, John Neville, 3rd Baron Latimer, who had been born in 1493 and who was already twice widowed and with 2 children, Margaret and John. This was a step up for Catherine, as Latimer was a peer and the marriage gave her a higher status, a large home to run and stepchildren to oversee the care of. The family lived at Snape Castle, I can already feel the Harry Potter jokes coming, in North Yorkshire, and at Charterhouse in London. Just as with her later stepchildren through her marriage to Henry, she did well in this role, at least with Margaret Neville, who later wrote in her will of 1545 that I was never able to render her grace sufficient thanks for the godly education and tender love and bountiful goodness which I have evermore found in her. Life as Lady Latimer was dangerous on occasion, however, and one of the most trying times during Catherine's second marriage came during the Lincolnshire Rising of October 1536 and the subsequent Pilgrimage of Grace, both revolts against Henry VIII's religious policies. Lord Latimer was captured by the rebels in October 1536 and taken into the custody of their leader, Robert Aske, in front of Catherine's eyes. He soon swore allegiance to them. According to his entry in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, he subsequently acted as a captain of the contingent from the bishopric of Durham and Richmond, and was one of the representatives of the insurgents who put the latter's case to the Duke of Norfolk at Doncaster on the 27th of October. He was similarly among the leaders of the Rising when they gathered at York on the 21st of November and at Pontefract early in December. Later, he would say he acted under duress and had hoped to persuade the rebels to cease their operations. He convinced Norfolk, who was loyal to the king, that this was the case, but whether or not it was true is still debated. In December 1536, he went to London to explain himself, and in his absence, rebels, who interpreted his decision to leave as a betrayal, attacked Snape Castle in January 1537 and imprisoned Catherine and the children there in order to force his return. Return he did and managed to talk himself and his family out of danger, but this only meant that suspicions remained about his loyalties in court circles. Poor Latimer just couldn't win. The Rising was put down with force by Henry's men, and when Latimer came back to London in the summer of 1537, he was locked up in the Tower. He probably only survived because he bribed Henry's then favoured minister Thomas Cromwell, and because Catherine's family were conspicuously loyal to the crown during the whole affair, and therefore increasing in political influence. Her uncle, Sir William, had helped to put down the Lincolnshire revolt. Her brother, also called William you'll remember, helped to suppress the pilgrimage, and their sister Anne was one of Queen Jane Seymour's ladies-in-waiting. In fact, Anne actually served all of Henry's wives, including eventually Catherine. It can only have helped that it appears Catherine herself took no part in supporting the revolts, though other women did, and David Starkey and Susan James have mused on whether this might be an indication that she had already converted to, or was at least flirting with, evangelicalism, for the rebellions were soundly rooted in Catholicism. There's no real evidence to tell us when her religious conversion took place, however, except that it seems to have been complete by the mid-1540s when she was urging Henry to complete the Reformation of the Church in England. Lord and Lady Latimer spent much of the next few years living in the south of England, and Latimer's reputation recovered somewhat as time went by. He attended Parliament in 1539, 1540 and 1542, and he and his family spent increasing amounts of time in the capital. By Christmas 1542, Catherine had joined the household of the king's daughter Mary at court, a turn of events which would have huge repercussions on the rest of her life, as it brought her into the king's orbit. At the same time, Lord Latimer's health had begun to fail, and on the 2nd of March 1543 he died. He was buried in St. Paul's Cathedral and left to Catherine a valuable jointure and custody of his daughter Margaret. We might pause at this point and wonder why Catherine had no children of her own. She was clearly able, given that she would go on to fall pregnant in 1547 by her final husband, and John Neville, Lord Latimer, already had 2 children by a previous wife, so there were apparently no issues there. It's possible that she had pregnancies and even short-lived children of whom no information has survived, or that her first husband was too unwell during their marriage for the couple to conceive. As for Lord Latimer, he too was ill during the later part of their marriage and travelling or imprisoned without Catherine for other parts of it. Perhaps, like Henry VIII, he was afflicted with impotency problems later in life, which prevented he and Catherine conceiving. We'll never know for sure. The Dowager Lady Latimer wasn't one for long gaps between marriages, and at the time of her second husband's death, she already had 2 other suitors in the offing. One was Thomas Seymour, brother to the late Queen Jane Seymour. We don't know how they met, but Catherine's presence at court and the connection she had there through her siblings may help to explain it. We know from a later letter to him, which I'll be showing you in a minute, that Catherine was in love with him and wanted them to be married at this point. Her biographer, Susan James, also argues that to want to wed her in 1543, when she was destined to be the Dowager Lady Latimer rather than the Dowager Queen of England, Seymour must have had genuine feelings for her too. This is because at about 30 years old, with good but not outstanding jointure incomes and potentially unable to produce heirs, she wasn't the kind of catch that she would be in later years as one of the wealthiest people in the kingdom. The relationship must have moved fast, though there's no suggestion that Catherine committed adultery, for Thomas had only returned from conducting the king's business on mainland Europe in January, and the fact that their interest in one another overlapped with the tail end of her marriage to Latimer demonstrates that Catherine was not the prim, proper and pious woman she is sometimes made out to be. Her plans to marry him would be thwarted, however, at least for the time being, by her other suitor, who was no less than the king himself. Henry's interest in Catherine also started while she was still a married woman, for he was sending her gifts of sleeves and pleats for dresses at least a fortnight before Latimer died, and visiting his daughter Mary's apartments several times a day in February 1543, though hardly to see his long-suffering offspring. Catherine now faced an unenviable choice: marry the man she loved or marry the king, who offered her his hand in the latter part of the spring. Catherine ultimately chose Henry, inasmuch as she really had a choice. He wasn't the type to take no for an answer after all, but it was an incredibly hard decision, as she explained to Seymour in this letter written shortly after Henry's death 4 years later, in which she said, "I would not have you to think that this mine honest goodwill towards you to proceed of any sudden motion or passion. For as truly as God is God, my mind was fully bent the other time I was at liberty to marry you before any man I knew. Howbeit God withstood my will therein most vehemently for a time, and, through his grace and goodness, made that possible which seemeth to me most unpossible, that was, made me to renounce utterly mine own will, and to follow his will most willingly." As this letter shows, Catherine would continue to harbour feelings for Thomas throughout her marriage to Henry, who I don't believe she loved, at least not romantically, and in fact she went straight back to him with scandalous alacrity as soon as she was able. Again, this is hardly the model of pious behaviour, but I love that it shows so much of Catherine's personality. Far from being a cookie-cutter 16th century wife dedicated solely to God and her husband, she was evidently much more complicated than that, with a strong faith and sense of duty, but also much more earthly desires which couldn't always be easily reconciled with her religion. Reconcile them she did, however, in 1543, for the throne beckoned. On the 10th of July, a licence was granted for the King's 6th wedding and Catherine's 3rd, and it took place 2 days later in the Queen's Closet in Hampton Court Palace, in the presence of Henry's daughters and Catherine's sister, among others. The former Catherine Parr was now Queen, and the rest, as they say, is history. If you'd like to know what happened next, remember to watch my other video on Catherine's life, which covers her queenship, final marriage to Thomas Seymour, his scandalous behaviour with her teenage stepdaughter, the future Elizabeth I, and Catherine's death. You can access this either through a link in the description box, or the link which is just about to pop up in the end cards. You can also learn more about Henry and his wives by watching my 6 Wives and Tudor Monarchs playlists. Let me know in the comments below what you find most interesting about Catherine's life prior to her becoming queen. And until next time, I'll leave you with my standard sign-off phrase, which I think Catherine, who was an advocate of lifelong education, would have approved of. keep learning.